Hey, can everyone hear me okay? Excuse me. Hello, hey everyone. Oh, the dog's barking. Can you hear me? Oh, cool, sweet. Can you hear the dog barking in the background? More importantly. Hi everyone, it's me, Rick. You might remember me from last week, or the campaign I run for some of you guys. I'm doing pretty good. Thank you for coming tonight. I have come prepared this evening. I have a hang on, the phone's ringing. I have a gin and tonic tonight, which will hopefully make things go much more smoothly. Yes. Well, maybe for you, Kat, but he should know better. I'm just going to close a few things off so I'm less distracted. So yes, who am I? I am Rick R.G. Wood. I am I definitely dislike people less. So Morgan's saying I definitely dislike people less when there's a dog involved. Oh right, yeah. Dogs make everyone more likable, which is why I got one, because I'd be pretty unpopular without him, to be honest. So I'm RG Rick, and I am a publisher in the Dungeon Masters Guild. under my imprint, which you can see here, Grizzly Eye Games. So, yep, you can see I publish. I've got a few things that I've published. The Enchanted, which is a book of rules for low, my sort of custom rules for low fantasy characters in Dungeons and Dragons. And this is, I'm going to release a number of these. So this has got two backgrounds. The Fey Touched and the Fey Exile. So it's like the Fey. It's very small. It's only like 2 or 3 pages, but it's very cheap to buy, not to produce. But yeah, and so I'm pretty proud of this. I'm going to publish more of these. I've got a couple on the line, including the Eldritch, which I'm working on at the moment. I have unique backgrounds, which is like my free to. This is free, so if you want to try before you buy, this just contains the rules without the illustrations or the unique backgrounds, the backgrounds themselves from the Enchanted, but it'll give you a taste. And of course, my pride and joy at the moment, my latest release, which is the Vermin, which is available for purchase now. $1.99. I think that's very reasonable considering it's 10 pages with illustrations and adventure, loads of stuff in there. So I'm Morgan's saying I'm high class and professional, but she must have accidentally got onto someone else's Twitch stream. They must have gone. Sorry, I apologise. They must have gone to someone else's Twitch stream to observe that. So, yes. So that is. So that's the Vermin and what I'm doing, Grizzly Eye Games. So before I begin tonight, I'm just gonna go through some of the things I've been looking at over the last fortnight. Yes, what have I been looking at? Perry Mason. I watched the first episode of the new HBO. I think it's available on the HBO Max thing, which platform streaming service, which really launched this week. Yep. So it's really good. It is noir, very noir. It's got an amazing cast. It looks fantastic. It looks like a movie. So yeah, if you like noir, and who doesn't, try and get. I'm looking for. I've got the next episode lined up. I think it just got released, so I'm looking forward to that. What else have I been doing? I've been looking at. I just finished reading this. I don't know if you can see that. Lie Sleeping, which is a. It's interesting, yeah. So it's a series of books. So Lie Sleeping by Ben Aronovich, who I've actually been reading Ben Aronovich for most of my adult life. Ironically, he's not a great author, but I have been reading him a long time. He used to write. I used to be a big Doctor Who fan, like a massive Doctor Who fan, and in the 90s. So in the 90s, early 90s, Doctor Who got cancelled by the BBC in an extremely short-sighted decision. So instead of letting it die, a number of authors got together and started writing fictional books set around the Doctor Who, follow on from the Doctor. So Ben Aronovich wrote some of those books. I think that's how he got into writing. And years later, he started the Rivers of London series, of which I think this is actually the last one. So Kat's asking, aren't all Brits required to be Doctor Who fans? No, I think, well, I actually have mixed feelings about Doctor Who now. I used to be a massive fan. I used to be obsessed with it when I was a teenager, but I'm not super keen of the Russell T Davies reboot. I sort of found it. So Morgan's saying that they're not a fan. Oomph. I love that. Oomph. I read a few of them, and they're consistently misogynistic. Oh yeah, well yeah. I can't imagine they were particularly. To be honest, they were terrible books. Oh, you read these? Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm going to get onto that in a second. The Ivanovich stuff, the Rivers of London. So, yeah. So basically, this is the best way to describe it is. I'm not really a fan of those. Well, okay, so they're pretty well written. They're pretty well written. They fly off the page, and to be honest with you, in this day and age, that's like a massive plus for me. Most books are like I can't. I picked up. This is going to sound very controversial, but I picked up. I tried to read the original Harry Potter. I can't remember, the Philosopher's Stone, I think it is, and I couldn't get through that. I don't understand at all. It was just, for me, it was a kid's book. It was unreadable, and I don't really understand lots of this stuff. But this is readable. This is readable. So the best way to describe it. Oh no, sorry, Morgan's getting very upset that I slagged off Harry Potter. Oops. My husband. I have to say, my husband is a massive fan. So there we go. So yeah, I I'm used to my controversial Harry Potter opinions. So live sleeping. The reason I talk about Harry Potter is live sleeping is basically a adult Harry Potter, sort of like Harry Potter meets The Bill or Harry Potter meets CSI London. I don't know if you probably don't. No one probably remembers The Bill, so it's like yeah, yes, and it shares some of the problems associated with Harry Potter as well. So it's there's three main problems with it. Three. First one is it follows that sort of weird thing that Harry Potter has, which is this sort of British class upper middle class thing it has. So in the Rivers of London world, magic has died out, and there's only one practitioner really left. Yeah, and it's he comes from a line of magicians, wizards who descend from Newton, Isaac Newton, who was the original member of the Folly, which is the school of magic that has now become co-opted by the Metropolitan Police. So effectively, it's the Metropolitan Police Department responsible for dealing with abnormal phenomena. Um, sorry, a little sip there. Yeah. So it's sort of, well, originally the first few books are. Morgan is saying that it's styled as a procedural detective drama, and I think the first books are, but there's an overarching plot with this sinister figure called the Faceless Man, and it actually gets resolved. This is the last one set in London. There is a sequel to this, but I believe it's set in Germany, and I think it's a completely new cast of characters. I don't even know. It might even have stopped with the police. So, yeah. So it suffers. So like the Folly is very patriarchal, very classist. They're obviously it's yet like Harry Potter. It is another sort of stand-in for public schools or private schools, as this is called over the Atlantic. They're all public school educated, and the character, I can't even remember his name, is Peter Grant, which is a completely unmemorable main character name, and that sort of brings me to my second point: is the main character is just really a cipher. So he's supposed to be of Sierra Leone descent and born and bred in London. He's supposed to be a bit hard, but Ben Aronovich is none of those things. He's probably just a very pasty geek like myself, and it shows. Like the way that the character talks is is very sort of blokey. It's really like it just cringes a bit. One place he uses the word shufty, which if you're a Londoner, you know, yeah, people did used to use that word, but they don't anymore. And anyone who uses the word shufty now it's not really Cockney. Yeah, I mean, yeah, and well, there are problematic elements with the work. Morgan's saying Peter Grant is fickle and objectifies women while framing it as worship. Although technically, he is going out with a goddess. Spoiler, in the book, but yeah. And as well as it seems a bit weird now because and I guess it's in the events of Black Lives Matter and things like that. Sort of centering on the police suddenly seemed a bit tasteless. So I was a bit uncomfortable to start with reading it, and he's pretty sympathetic to the police, and well, perhaps more than sympathetic. It perhaps lets the police off a bit, and it's very sort of. I mean, he is a policeman. The central character is a policeman, so it is kind of authoritarian and very sort of, yeah. And that felt a bit weird. But you know, it's a read. So there's that. What else am I looking at? Morgan's saying something. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is what it is. It is Morgan's saying I didn't get through. I mean, I did get through a few books before deciding it wasn't a first book snafu. I would have kept reading if not for that. Yeah, I mean, it's a confection. It's a light treat. It's nothing serious. I flew through this in like a week, which is a very short time for me to read a book. Although spoilers are not spoilers, but being up front here, I had insomnia last night. I only slept like 2 hours, so I spent most of the night reading it. So yeah, lie sleeping. I probably wouldn't read another book again. I think that's it. This was the last one. I'm going to send this off to recycling or to the secondhand bookshop. And I think I'm reading the sequel to Circe next, which I'll probably talk about next time I stream. What else have I been looking at? Aha. Yes, Stone Shard. I'm very excited about this. So, yeah. Yeah, this is a game I'm very excited about. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah. It's I've sort of got really into indie games. I really feel that the indie game revolution is highly positive, and I'm really happy with some of the indie games I've played, like FTL, and of course I probably talked about this last week. One of my big inspirations, Darkest Dungeon, and I guess the guys at Red Hook Games who produced Darkest Dungeons have been pushing Stone Shard as a sort of ancestor of Darkest Dungeon, and I'm pretty excited to play this. It is actually available now, but it's only on Windows, and I'm a Mac boy, and the Steam platform, and it's in early access, and I think it's fairly short and simple. So they are going to bring out a Mac version of that. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Let's see what's catch up on chat a bit. That's not right. I'm sure we're more ahead of chat. So at the moment, I'm got a bit of a different layout tonight. So obviously, I'm still being a bit cheap. Yeah, it's like Kat is asking, is it like a role-playing game or hack and slash type? I think it is a role-playing game. It's quite a sort of dark, gritty one, and I think it's, as you saw, it's sort of two-dimensional pixel game. Like you're an adventurer exploring this sort of wilderness, and it's got the right vibe. I don't want to talk too much about it because I'm not an expert. I'll probably pop this in the chat so you can have a look at it yourselves. But yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. I think once it comes out on the Mac, it'll be the next thing I buy. So yeah, and what else am I looking at? Oh, okay, so this one's quite an important one. So hang on, go away. Let me share this. Can I share this to Twitch? No, I have to. Hang on. Okay, so the next thing I've been looking at was Matt Colville streamed last week. Was it last week or maybe no? It's over the I think it was last Friday. I think he only streamed for like an hour. So another disclosure. And if you haven't heard of Matt Colville, he's a big inspiration. It's the whole reason I started DMing. He started a bunch of videos on. He's a YouTuber. He started a series of videos called Running the Game, which were just like primers to running Dungeons and Dragons, but he's just got amazing screen presence, and he manages to. He's just a great speaker. He's just got. I mean, the guy really should be on TV. He's an actor, and I'm pretty excited to. So I'm going to share the link to the Twitch stream. So he released this on the back of the whole orc controversy. No. Oh, shit. Excuse my French, I've lost the screen. Oh. Go away. Okay, hang on. Had the chat screen open. No, go away. Okay, we're back. Okay. Yeah, so there's a link to the to Matt Colville's stream. So yeah, he published that off the back of the whole orc controversy. So it's been doing the rounds online. So I'm just trying to think how I can summarize it. You're probably already aware, but orcs are really coded as people of color, or they're not perhaps coded that way, but they have a lot of very sort of negative racist tropes sort of bundled into them, while not being obviously racist, or well, perhaps not, they are obviously racist, but perhaps not being directly racist, which I think is part of the problem, and it's causing that's part of what's causing the controversy. So off the back of this, Matt talked about Dungeons and Dragons and the future of Dungeons and Dragons, and he brought up the concept of disco Dungeons and Dragons, which is kind of interesting. The idea being that 5e Dungeons and Dragons has a bunch of, problematic baggage, and we really need to create a new Dungeons and Dragons, perhaps, or a new movement within Dungeons and Dragons. So he sort of made the parallel that old school Dungeons and Dragons is conservative, and that we need a more sort of liberal version of Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah, that's true, actually. So Morgan said, I didn't realise he had thoughts about it on Twitter. He's been acting like Black Lives Matter isn't happening. Although I don't think that's entirely fair. I have actually seen him tweet a few times. Perhaps not over the last couple of weeks, but certainly when the protests first started. But I'll need to double check that. Perhaps I'm wrong on that one. So the point was, he made this division between conservative role-playing Dungeons and Dragons, and that Dungeons and Dragons is fundamentally conservative, versus sort of liberal, well, he called it actually progressive Dungeons and Dragons, which I think is actually really interesting, and I want to talk about that for like 5 minutes. But before I do, I'm just going to take a sip of G&T. I don't think his observation was actually that profound. So, yeah, so I think what he's talking about, so disco was itself a sort of reaction to a very sort of anodyne. So Kat's asking, curious, do you know why he quotes disco, unquote, Dungeons and Dragons? Which is a good question. So I honestly, I wasn't listening that closely, because my thoughts are spinning off about why I disagreed with him. But I think what he means is disco was a reaction to the sort of stifling conformity of pop. It was this sort of diverse, gay, queer, very sort of non-centralized sort of, I guess, like reaction to sort of the 60s and perhaps the 70s, sort of liberalness of those periods. And I think that's what he wanted to see with Dungeons and Dragons. Although, to be honest with you, I kind of feel like that's already happening. I think, like, if you check out, perhaps it's not happening in mainstream parts of the hobby, but I think what we're seeing is if you go to like itch, and there's quite a big tabletop role playing scene on itch.io at the moment, and that's, I think that really is the disco Dungeons and Dragons. Really, there's a lot of pretty cool stuff going on there. Very sort of creative, like mini role playing games, and people sort of experimenting quite heavily. Although I have to admit, I've sort of looked along it and not really seen much that I stood out for me at the moment, but it's going. But what was interesting, I suppose, is this dichotomy between modern and old school Dungeons and Dragons, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot. So, and it really boils down to fantasy and the roots of fantasy and where that fantasy comes from. And the original people who wrote fantasy were so extremely reactionary and extremely what I call regressive as opposed to progressive, not necessarily conservative. So I think to describe the difference between what I call regressive and progressive in terms of fantasy, and we need to look at science fiction and fantasy. So an example of what progressive fiction is science fiction, or particularly golden age science fiction, which the idea is that the future is going to be better. The future is this. The past is something we are getting away from, and we're heading towards this amazing future. And fantasy is the reverse, or traditional fantasy, such as J.R. Tolkien, Paul Anderson. They very much posited the idea that the reverse of that the past was a golden age, and that the present is getting worse than the past. So, for example, and indeed, they're often set in periods of fall, and whereas science fiction is set in periods of rising to the future, things are getting better. In fantasy, things are generally getting worse. The world is emptying, and indeed, both rely on golden ages in science fiction or traditional progressive science fiction. The future is the golden age. It's going to come. It's just around the corner. We just have to let technology do its thing. We just have to get there. Whereas regressive fantasy, the golden age is already gone, and the age of the elves has been and gone. Things like that. So then what we've seen. Then postmodernism hits town, and we've seen a revolution in both fields. So in fantasy, in science fiction, the reverse became anti-progressive. Science fiction became anti-progressive with cyberpunk. Cyberpunk is anti-progressive. Science fiction, the future's actually worse. It's not necessarily positing, though. I call it, instead of calling it regressive science fiction, I call it anti-progressive, because it's not necessarily saying the past was any better, but it's certainly saying that the future is a nightmare that we want to avoid, or is inevitable. And then we also saw in fantasy there's a similar postmodern revolution, which is that we saw the rise of writers, particularly in mind at the head of the pack was George R.R. Martin, obviously the Game of Thrones, who posited that this sort of anti-regressive fantasy, but again, it isn't progressive, because I don't necessarily think that George Martin thinks the future's wonderful, although perhaps he does. But I don't think all the other authors of that period say that. I include like Glenn Cook, Joe Abercrombie, and Robert Becker in that, and they generally tend to write fiction where the past is horrible. It tends to be quite brooding and nasty. In Game of Thrones, the past is not a nice place to live, basically. And so Dungeons and Dragons inherits directly from the regressive school of fantasy. However, what we're seeing is over the editions, there's been a lot of power creep, and it's slowly crept from sort of old school low fantasy to very very sort of different type of fantasy. I, it's high fantasy now, but there's also a very different style to it. So it's, I think it's sort of come to a head in what I call the Matt Mercer school of fantasy of Dungeons and Dragons, which is this sort of, and that is progressive fantasy in the sense that the characters in Matt Mercer's campaign live in a world that is nominally in the past, but really it's sort of set in the future, in that we have magic has sort of transformed the world. There are obviously holdovers, but fundamentally it's reached this sort of very accepted sort of state, and we have this extremely diverse cast of characters. I don't know really where I'm going with that. I haven't finished that thought, but yeah. So it was quite interesting, and I think it's a subject I'm really interested in, about what the old fantasies were, what the reaction to that, and I think we're seeing some new stuff coming out of Dungeons and Dragons. So there's this new school in Dungeons and Dragons, which is obviously the Critical Role people, but there's also the old school. So there's people who basically, there's two groups in fifth edition. The Critical Role group, who are the new people who've come in, and then there are the people who were playing third edition about 20 years ago. Skipped to Pathfinder to avoid fourth edition, and when fifth edition came back, bounced back, and they're quite, not all of them, but I think that a lot of them are like quite backward looking. And I think what we're seeing in the industry is a tension between those two groups. But anyway, enough about that. I probably bored most of you. Morgan's gone very quiet, so I wonder if they're bored to tears. I wouldn't blame them. Okay, so what am I doing? So what's next on my agenda? I don't really want to talk about myself, but that's what I put in the agenda a bit. But I think I might skip that because they've been talking about me for a while. I don't even know what the time is. 40 minutes I've been talking about myself. Half an hour. I might cover this quickly just to say what's new in Grizzly Eye Games world at the moment. So what's new is I've added a link to the Grizzly Eye Games GitHub repository, which is where I do my code work for some of the projects. So what's really interesting here is Vermin Monster, which is something I've been working on for a while. I use it in my publications. Excuse me, I've used it in the Vermin. It's basically a little widget you can put into any HTML page, and it generates a monster stat block. And it has lots of nifty features. For example, it can calculate average hit points, and most importantly, it can calculate the challenge rating for you, which is a big thing. So check that out. I also blogged about the Merchants faction from last week. No, sorry, yeah, no. Morgan's saying, not a subject can just blurt out reactive thoughts. No, fair enough. Fair enough. Sorry, I don't know. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, probably, I don't know. Yeah, sorry. I'm just astonished that I can be so boring sometimes. But anyway, so yeah, so I blogged about the Merchants faction from last week that we created. So I renamed this the Assayers Guild. So originally the name we came up last week was the Merchants Consortium, but unfortunately that was unsatisfyingly anachronistic. Consortium is a little word that only really originated in the 19th century. So yeah, that's a shame. So I switched it to the Assayers Guild, which meant I could focus more on the fact that these guild members are mineral or precious metal assayers, people who work precious metal and measure precious metal. So they minted coins, and then they realized that if they minted coins, they could trade in those coins, which is kind of one of the important discoveries of the Renaissance, really, and allowed modern nations to evolve, was this understanding. But they've come about it, and they're keeping it to themselves because they're a guild. And yeah, so go to grizzlyeye.com. You can check that out there. Thanks, Morgan. I hope not. So yep. The only slight caveat here is I did post this on online. It didn't get a great amount of feedback. So I don't wonder if it's not the name. I think is a big problem here. I don't think it's the most exciting faction to be a member of. I'm not sure players would um, be jumping over each other to become members of a guild that works precious metals. I think maybe I need to jazz it up a bit before it's ready to go. I don't think this is the right format for that. What else did we do? I've been working on the Eldritch. I can show you that now. Let me go to twitter.com. So the Eldritch is a sequel to the Enchanted, and it includes 3 new unique backgrounds, some of which I've tested with my players. The 3 new unique backgrounds. So one is the Gift Bearer, which is kind of like Frodo from the Lord of the Rings. So someone has inherited a magical item that's given them their powers. Where's a tweet that I sent? I had a really popular tweet based on this. So the second one is hang on. Where are you? I can't have got rid of it or gone off. I've been living online a bit at the moment, so maybe it's disappeared off. Where is it? Here we go. So the second unique background from the Eldritch I'm working on is the Occultist. So this is someone who is a member of a secret cult, and that's why they have access to hidden powers, because this is sort of lore that's been kept from people for a while. This was a part of it. I created a list of random cabals or conspiracies you could be a member of. I'm quite happy with this. It's got like 10 likes, 2 retweets, and people had really positive feedback about this. So these are like, so let's look at one, for example, I'm quite happy with, the Inverti. So this is like an Illuminati type conspiracy. This mystic society seeks to free humanity from the stifling rule of nobility. To this end, they follow quixotic orders from the mysterious masters. Yeah, and people really like, I really like that. I think that's a great little, I really enjoyed writing these. I think it was nice to put factions into 1 or 2 words. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being a bit too verbose with the writing that I am doing. I probably will think about turning these into factions later. I'm thinking about having 1 book of factions, which is core factions, so like the Wizards Guild and things like that, and then perhaps a conspiracy one for more intrigue type campaigns, and I might put these in. So if you want to take a closer look at that, go to my Twitter, which is Grizzly Eye, at Grizzly Eye on Twitter, and take a look. Okay, and the other thing I was working on is some rules for advanced exploration. Well, really, this is, I'm not going to publish this yet. This is just a taster because it's definitely not ready. But this is, so there aren't really exploration rules in Dungeons and Dragons. Even though it's one of the 3 pillars of the game, or nominally one of the 3 pillars of the game, it's really underdeveloped. So they expanded some of the rules in Tomb of Annihilation, but I sort of, oh, thank you, yes, the membership rule for the Red Hand. I'm not going to call them the Red Hand because that reminds me of the Red Hand Gang, which was a TV show when I was little. I think I'm going to call them the Crimson Hand, but yeah. A cabal of assassin witches. Kat's saying, "Oh, I like the membership rule for the Hell one," and Kat's talking about the Red Hand. And to join the Red Hand, there are only 5 members of the Red Hand because it's a hand, and to join them, you have to kill one of the existing members. So that's a great storyline already for players. Your player could be, or even all your players could be members of the whole cabal. Well, that contradicts my rules for unique backgrounds, but I'm not going to go into that now. So expanded exploration rules. So yeah, so I've been trying to find new ways to handle exploration, because it's something that's a big feature of my Black Griffin campaign. So there's I come up with a few innovative features, I think. I've divided, so I've created what's called travel actions. So at the moment, there's lots of things you can do in exploration, but they're all like not clearly defined. So what I've come up is that exploration is divided into days. Each day you can take 3 travel actions, and you can see some of the travel actions here. You have things like forage, travel, which is where you actually move, navigation to find your way, resting. So you have to rest as part. Can't rest for free. You have to rest as part of it. One I'm most interested in, find bearings, which basically is a travel action you can take, which allows you to see the player's maps. And when you start exploring, you don't really know the terrain. So if you want to know where you're going or have a rough idea where you want to go, you find bearings and stuff. So I quite like that. That's quite nice, and I think that makes the rules of exploration a bit more predictable and accessible for dungeon masters. I've created what's called travel conditions. They're sort of like the conditions at the back of the player's guide, but obviously these are like environmental issues. So extreme cold, high visibility, lost is a travel condition. If you're lost, obviously you don't know where the hell you are. And some other things like chaos modifiers. So as a region has a chaos modifier, and depending on the player's party's actions, that can go up or down, which means it basically increases or decreases the likelihood of a random encounter, and increases or decreases the deadliness of any encounters you have. So there we go. So I'm quite happy with that. That's coming along quite nicely. So enough about that. Let's talk about game design. So what is this? So this is supposed to be a live stream about game design. Although it hasn't been so far tonight. So the idea is each week I do a little bit of game design, specifically for a new campaign I'm going to start up called The Last Post, of which Morgan and Kat, I think, will be players. And last week we looked at one of the player factions. We tried to develop the Merchants Guild. This week, we were looking at the Wardens of the West, a new faction I want to try and delve into. Let's see. So, and obviously, to chat, and this is hopefully not just about me. I'm always keen for everyone else's input, and you probably will have your input while I'm doing this. So, I'm just going to go over the elements of a faction that I covered last week. So these are divided into 2, the mechanical and the fluff. So in the mechanical, we have a number of ranks and titles for ranks. So we had vested trader and merchant prince as increasingly high ranks, so 1 to 5 ranks. And each rank should have a number of faction features, which are like class features. Generally, the first rank has sort of soft background feature, like the background, like criminal contact or something like that. I think for the Mercenaries Guild or the Assayers Guild last week, we had a high standing contact, so some official, that tax collector or vizier or someone important, that is your contact and that you can lean on for favours. Very sort of soft though, no real no real mechanical things. So the other types of features are also things like authority and reputation. So bonuses, advantage perhaps to certain charisma checks, based on like whether you're seen as someone, a friendly faction. Perhaps people are frightened of you, so you get advantage to intimidation. Perhaps you have authority, which means you can order people about. Then also the other types of stuff you have are followers, for example, could be a feature for a faction. Strongholds, I haven't really worked many strongholds in, but it's something I want to try and do. Perhaps with the Wardens of the West, we can look at that. And finally, resources, so stuff like loans we had last week. The Merchants Guild offers loans to players. Yeah, things like that. Let me just catch up on chat a sec. Okay, cool. So then there's the fluff, which is probably really more important. I should really mention that first. So each faction has a bunch of mechanical benefits, which I guess would be the carrot that would give the players a reason to join up to get access to these cool things. Generally, the mechanical benefits are generally temporal power. So, as I said, like resources, castles, increases to reputation. They're not like class features that give you power, like literal, physical, or magical power. So that's the carrot, but factions need fluff. They need to come alive, otherwise they'll just be quite sterile artifacts, and the players don't really connect with them and just use them for resources. And that's a wasted opportunity as well, because I think factions can be a big source of motivation for the characters, and they can identify with them, or they can oppose them, or oppose some of their goals and beliefs. So the main piece of fluff is the story of the faction, is sort of the central thing. What does this faction do? Where's it going? How did it come about? What's its role basically in the world, and where what's its story? And part of that is also the central conflict. All factions should have some conflict built into them, probably with another faction. In the case of, we looked at the Royal College of Magic last week. They are a group of wizards who have formed together to sort of control magic. And they don't particularly like other magic users. So that was the conflict there. So that's really important, I think, because everything that really hangs off the conflict, that generally gives you an idea of what types of everything else sort of evolves from that. So it's quite an important concept. The second piece of elements of a faction is mystery within the faction. That's quite important. I think factions need to have some sort of central mystery as well, like the Assayers Guild. I think we decided that the spice was the mystery of that. What spice? How does the Assayers Guild stay in power? What stops the kings and queens of the realm chopping all the merchants' heads off and taking all their stuff? So it's this the Assayers Guild have access to this thing called the spice. No one knows what it is. It's in demand. It's extremely valuable. It's forbidden, but the nobility need it, want it, and only the Assayers can supply it. So that's how they retain their power, and that's the mystery, and that adds a sort of extra bit of flavour as well, and perhaps, obviously, a huge potential for adventure there. The third bit of fluff element that we need to come up with is goals. So beliefs and goals are quite important. And probably the most important thing, I think we found last week, the most important thing for the faction is coming up with a sort of purpose, which takes the form of the various missions. So we created a missions table, and we created missions you could participate in. Morgan says it's the sort of thing, get out of it what you put into it thing. I'm not sure what that's in relation to, though, because I haven't been monitoring chat for a while. But it sounds very wise. So, maybe I'm missing some chat. Oh, hang on, okay, I'm missing some chat. Factions should have a lot of potential for shaping. So, Kat's saying factions should have a lot of potential for shaping a character, whether they align with the ideals, method, allies, or not. Yeah. The fluff makes factions live, and if it lives, then the PCs will live. If you want more than this, just this, then that. Gameplay, yeah. And to honestly, this is a print. So we're all enthusiastically agreeing with ourselves. And this is true of all game design, really. The fluff is more important. The story is more important. If you look at the player's handbook, the popular character classes are ones that have really strong story. Like the Warlock's really popular, I think, and that's got the Pact. That central story of the Pact really draws a lot of people in. I think the Sorcerer's got quite a good story as well, and has lots of flexibility in that story, that sort of you inherited magic through blood or through some innate qualities. The Barbarian, it's quite a strong story. The rage mechanic, I think, is quite a strong identity for that. So I think the fluff is. I think a lot of people online focus on the mechanics, but the fluff is really the most important thing, and probably the thing that we want to focus on So, talking of which, let's focus on the fluff for the Wardens of the West. So, the last post is my Keep on the Borderlands style campaign for 5th edition. So, I want to offer the players, when they first arrive at the Keep, a number of faction options. So there's going to be a magic guild, there's going to be the temple, which is the major religious institution in my game world. So that covers, and then there's Thieves' Council, which will have a presence in the Keep as well. And then obviously that covers magic users, arcane casters, clerics and paladins covered, rogues covered, but what we haven't covered is the martial factions, which is a bit trickier. So I think the Wardens of the West are going to be one of the martial factions. So in particular, so the Wardens of the West, I do have a story for them in mind already. So the Wardens of the West, I sort of see as the Ranger, perhaps as a sort of matching story. They're sort of the Ranger faction. So in my campaign, the Keep, the nominal Keep, that houses the last post, which is literally just a post. Yeah, it does sound rangery. Thanks, Morgan. Perhaps a bit too rangery. I'm a bit. Hopefully, we'll be able to find a place for the Wardens because I've been struggling to find a place for them. I'm hoping we can get them not just be a ranger faction, but a martial faction to include fighters. Then they're going to be more of a neutral faction as well. So the factions in the Keep are generally lawful factions, and I see the Wardens perhaps having more of a seat sort of outside the Keep. So yeah, so I see them as sort of the ranger/fighter, a ranger/fighter faction. Though there will be another military faction inside the Keep, perhaps a mercenary group. I haven't quite figured that out yet. But the Wardens of the West are. So let's start typing. Let's see what I've written. Yes. So. Yeah. So what did the Wardens of the West? What is their story? So what I'm thinking of is the Wardens of the West are actually a dead faction. They are a faction that was popular once upon a time and has actually gone. And what's happening is that perhaps someone has remembered, but it is a liminal. So Morgan's saying that it's a liminal sounding name, which is a good point. Liminal's a good theme for the Wardens of the West. There are other boundaries than nature/man, like magic/religion. Yeah, and I think the Wardens of the West perhaps bridge that gap between the lawful and the chaotic. So I'm going to emphasise law and chaos as the axis in this campaign, much in the same way that basic Dungeons and Dragons. I'm hoping to make my own take on that to be less conservative or less regressive, as we discussed earlier. And I'm hoping the Wardens fit into that. So the Lost faction, let's create a header for this. The Wardens once patrolled, that's a bad word, ranged across the Westerly Reaches. So the Westerly Reaches is my name for the Borderlands. So part of the reason I'm doing this is that the BT Keep on the Borderlands, the players travel from the west to the east to tame the wilderness. So in an attempt to try and stop that particularly unpleasant narrative, I've reversed the direction. Well, actually the reverse, so Kat's asking, so kind of like the Night's Watch, which is another faction worked in terms of being a group falling into disrepair. that's the reverse. So they once had a glorious past, and then actually that's probably the central mystery of them. They disappeared. We don't know why. Actually, I think that's actually a really good mystery. They've gone. They were powerful. They had their own like keeps and safe houses all across the westerly reaches, and now they're gone. And they just disappeared, and no one knows why. And now, a few ranger types, sort of hoary, salt of the earth explorer types have banded together. And I think, what they've found is they've found the Keep of the Wardens, which is a terrible name, working name only. So someone stumbled across the Keep of the Wardens, rediscovered all this Warden lore, and recreated this faction. Okay. Let me finish this thought. The Lost Faction. Wardens must range across the reaches, keeping the balance of nature and protecting the weak. Then one night they disappeared, never to be seen again. That's weak source, but it needs some work. So let me just catch up on chat. So Morgan's saying, I'm suddenly thinking one of those old factions that emerged from something like a personal local feud, which the original member had to broaden in order to gain support, and the faction took on a life of its own. I love things like disappear in no explanation. It makes players nervous though, yeah. Well, that's a good point. Yeah, I didn't think about that, yeah. It would make players nervous. So why did they disappear, and if they retread on it, are they just going to reawaken it? So yeah, Character X, I haven't decided on this. NPC X stumbled upon the lost Keep of the Wardens. What he discovered, yeah. No, he discovered much lost Warden lore. Okay, so there we go. So I think we already have our story. The Wardens of the West were powerful, perhaps not powerful, but they did exist. They were a force for perhaps as close to good as you can get. They certainly weren't a lawful group. I don't see them as a military group. I see them as a sort of perhaps a sort of monastic kind of almost. They the Guardian's Vow. I see them almost like a paladin equivalent, but without the paladin stuff. The Wardens take a vow of guardianship, swearing to keep the balance of nature and protect the weak. Yeah, so they're not like a... So this is already getting really good. This is why thinking and writing this stuff is... So Morgan made the rather precise analysis. I think so. It's good. So Kat said it's good that players are nervous, and Morgan said I think so, but I find the average player a bit hand-holdy, tongue out, monkey face, which is a very good point. But yeah. So what's good about the Wardens of the West? So we've got the core story. The Wardens of the West were like Aragorn from The Lord of the Rings. They are not nobles, they are not a military faction. It is a calling. They wander around from place to place helping people. They probably act mostly on their own. I can see it's quite a lonely faction. The central mystery is that they used to be everywhere and now they just disappeared. Where did they go? Someone stumbled upon the Keep of the Wardens, and now the Wardens are back again. And they're looking for new members, which is where hopefully some of the party members come in. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. I think that's got some meat and bones on it. But yeah, the only problem is factions that are lonely and don't have much direction might be a problem for players that, as Morgan quite aptly said, a bit hand-holdy. But let's see what missions we can come up with. Missions are probably the last thing we do, or they probably should be the first thing we'll do with this, but let's see how that goes. So we've covered the story, we've covered the mystery, we have the goals of it, which are to guard the land, to protect nature, and to protect the weak. Protect the weak's probably a bit weak. Maybe just make this protect nature. Yeah, I'm not super happy with the protect the weak part because that's a bit hackneyed. If there's any suggestions, Kat or Morgan, I'd love to hear them for alternatives to motivations for them, but we can cover that later in more detail. But they have a mystery, they have a story, they have goals. So the only thing that's missing is conflict. So there's at the moment there's no central conflict here. I'm struggling to think of a good conflict for the Wardens of the West off the top of my head. Yeah, I know that is a bit of a puzzler. So I can imagine conflict being another faction. Yeah. So the Guardians apostrophe vow is the principle by which the Wardens will live their lives. I think that perhaps they can hold no land is an important part of the vow because they're wanderers, they're Wardens. I think the point of they're trying to perhaps keep the Westerly Reaches a wilderness, and to that end, they don't want kings. They don't want to be kings, so they can hold no land. That's true. Well, this is what I'm thinking. So Morgan said, "Well, Order rarely has ultra resonance true goal," and I'm wondering if that is the friction here, that they don't want power. The Wardens of the West, one of their primary directives is to make sure no one power holds the Westerly Reaches, and perhaps that's central conflict here, is that they want to keep the Westerly Reaches free of Order, but obviously many of the orderly factions, the lawful factions, are not going to like that. I'm not sure I can think of a good way to phrase that. No kings rule in the Reaches. So Morgan said maybe they're a bit anarchic. Yeah, I have a bit of a depends. There's many different types of anarchism. They certainly are anarchic in the sense that they are not lawful, but I see them more as a neutral faction. Chaos. There are going to be chaotic factions in the Westerly, very chaotic factions in the Westerly Reaches. So I should probably give you a bit of background for what I'm planning for the Westerly Reaches. So one of the key factions in the Westerly Reaches, or perhaps not factions, one of the key antagonists are what are called the Starling Kings. So basically the Westerly Reaches sit at the edge of the Low Kingdoms. They're an untamed wilderness, and for that reason many people, outcasts, criminals, political dissidents, people accused of witchcraft get exiled there, or escape there. So generally what happens, and in particular criminals get exiled there, and of course what happens when criminals get exiled to a wilderness, they band together as bandits. So we have these sort of anti-kings, the Starling Kings, which are basically a group of separate groups of bandits, basically, and they're sort of first level kind of antagonist. So that's where Oren and Leah headed when they were together. Morgan asked if their character and Kat's and Hope's, I think Leah's Hope's character, are headed to the Westerly Reaches. Actually, this campaign is going to be set in a completely new world. So Cat is of course going to come along, but I don't know if Red's going to come along. So no, unfortunately, Orin, Leah, and Red, as they are in the current Black Griffin campaign, which is set in another generic fantasy land called The Land, which is a terribly unimaginative name, but this world's that's much more of a sort of 16th century. This is more of a medieval. This is set in the Low Kingdom, which is much more of a medieval period. So the character, I don't know if there'll be crossover. I mean, of course, you can cross over, as long as your characters forget everything that happened in Black Griffin. But yeah. So they already are very sort of anarchic. There's bandit, the Starling Kings, and they are like anarchic factions, bandits. Really, they're sort of trying to create their own kingdoms, and they're doing this by force, by brutality, and while at the same time they want to create their own power centers, their own sort of orders. They are basically against the order of the Low Kingdoms, the sort of civilization to the east. So that the reason I'm saying this, I need to pitch the Wardens of the West in the middle of that. They're not anarchic in that sense. They certainly don't want any kings to rule in the westerly reaches, but I guess they probably don't want the Starling Kings to rule either. And I think we have our conflict. So my players are discussing their plans of running away together. Okay, so no kings rule in the reaches. The Wardens one of the fundamental tenets of the Wardens is that no kings or queens no single power should rule in the westerly reaches. They are opposed to the expansion of the nobles from the Low Kingdoms. But they also work against the growing power of the Starling Kings. Cool, there we go. Wow, we've got everything. We've got the full trump. Morgan's saying, ooh, Orin is old enough to be Leah's parents, probably grandparent in the land. How old is Orin? Morgan, I don't think unforgivably, I don't think I know. Cool. Mid-40s. A great age. I only say that because I'm in my mid-40s. Renown, ranks, features. Actually, how are we doing for time tonight? I've still got a bit of time. And my whole voice is starting to get a bit hoarse, so we'll see how long I can last. I'm not going to fill in the renown, let's just fill in the ranks. So, this is obviously where things start to get a little bit tricky. I sort of picture, Morgan's talking about Orin's age, but I sort of feel that like Orin is one of those perhaps slightly ageless individuals who is in their mid-40s but could equally be in their like late 20s or early 30s or even in their like 50s. They're just perhaps even a little bit elfin in that case. I don't know if that's entirely accurate though. So this is a tough bit, coming up with features and coming up with ranks. So ranks are the titles. Actually, I should rename them to titles. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to cheat. Let me see if you can see this. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this. This is the Dungeons and Dragons Rules Cyclopedia, which I don't use to play Dungeons and Dragons because this is a monster tome. But basically, this was very popular when it came out. It basically consolidates all the rules of the original basic Dungeons and Dragons together into one volume. Most importantly, I think it had ranges in it, and most importantly, those ranges had titles, which is important for me because I'm hoping we can steal the names to give us some inspiration. But no, I don't actually think this does have a Ranger class in it. I think the Ranger class didn't come till Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, perhaps. No Rangers here. No, there's nothing. Check the index. I don't actually think this has an index. Although look at these lovely old school hex maps. This is a hex map of one of my favourite. So the original basic Dungeons and Dragons was set not in the Forgotten Realms, but in a completely separate world originally called the Known Lands, or the Known World, which I think was a great name for a fantasy setting, but became Mystara. And one of my favourite, Mystara was terrible. It was basically just a mishmash. You had an Arabic desert kingdom right next to a verdant elf forest kingdom and things like that. But one of my favourite parts of it was the Principalities of Galantry, of which this is a map of. And that was my favourite because it was basically a sort of medieval city-state Italy with a sort of central capital of which was a Venice analogue, and it was a kingdom of magic users, of wizards, which obviously for teenage Ricardo was like catnip to a cat. So just look up the ranges in here in the index, see if they're going to give us any help here. No ranges. Okay, so we're on our own, kids. Another source material. Low fantasy gaming. So this is an interesting one. By Stephen J. Grodzicki. It is a low magic version. It's a 5th edition hack, basically, but a low fantasy version of it. And I think they do have a Ranger class, and I think the classes do have titles. No, they don't. They don't have titles. Okay. Yeah, we're definitely on our own, kids. Okay. Okay, so maybe. So let's just. So my suggestion last week, which I'm completely ignoring this week, was that we just freestyle this and come up with things off the top of our heads, create a list, and things will evolve from that. So let's. No, not quite. So Morgan's asking, is low fantasy gaming low magic in the original Dungeons and Dragons sense? Yes, sort of. I think low fantasy or low magic is a really overloaded term. Low fantasy gaming is a sword and sorcery game, basically. So it's a low magic of Conan the Barbarian. But I don't necessarily think original Dungeons and Dragons was that kind of fantasy. I think it was more of a sort of Tolkien-esque kind of low magic, which has slightly different quality to it. But I assume you could use low fantasy gaming for any low fantasy. I'm not a big fan of it. It has a few wrinkles that I'm not super keen on. So I probably wouldn't use it, but I just bought it for inspiration. So the Wardens of the West. What ranks would the Wardens of the West have? What type of titles would they have? I mean, naively it would be things like private, military titles like captain, lieutenant, but I don't know. I can't spell lieutenant. I think the spell check's not working in this, which is very annoying. But that doesn't seem right. They're not a military organisation, they're the opposite of military organisation. In fact, they sort of aren't really an organisation at all, in the sense that they have a strict hierarchy. But no, I think they could have a strict hierarchy. Oh, okay, here we go. Wise father, mother, sort of the head, perhaps. Although these father, mother has religious connotations, and wise man, wise woman has witchy connotations. It's got to sound a bit fey, doesn't it? Yeah, I guess. Rangers, yeah, if it's going to be the Ranger faction. Morgan asks, it's got to sound a bit fey, doesn't it? And they are quite right. If this is going to be a Ranger faction, Rangers generally tend to be... They are effectively the martial class. They're effectively the... As paladins are to clerics, Rangers are to druids. They're like the druid paladin class. So not necessarily fey, but perhaps associated with the old ones, which is the fey are sort of linked to, but not quite the same. There's a weird relationship, so perhaps they hold with the old ways a little bit. But that still doesn't really help us out, because we know nothing about... I don't really know much about the old gods yet myself, and maybe just things like this. Maybe you could just do High Warden in training. Does that sound okay, or is that weak sauce? Be honest, guys. Check again. I haven't actually checked how many users we have logged on. Oh, we've got a few. Some I don't recognise. Commander Root, I think Chris is logged on. Hey Chris, if you're there. Sorry, let's go back to what I was doing. A bit too technical. Morgan says they're a bit too technical. High Warden I think would be fine. Warden in training, yeah. No, fair enough. Cat's observed Warden. So Morgan's observed they are a bit technical, which is true, accurate. Cat has observed High Warden I think would be fine. Warden in training needs to be a little. Yeah. Warden in trainings, yeah. Okay. And plus you've got to fill these out a bit more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So again, I think we're right. These aren't great, but I think you start filling in the blanks, and I think the rest will come. So so maybe what we could do is like you start. You're just a warden, and then perhaps we could do it the cardinal directions. So you become a warden of the north, then a warden of the south, a warden of the east, and then finally a warden. Fellow. So Morgan suggested you can use fellow somehow. Yeah, I like that. That sort of builds in with the fact that they're sort of more of a fellowship. So maybe the first one is Fellow Warden, which I think has a nice ring to it. Actually, maybe the first one's Green Initiate. And then once so rank 1, you are proving yourself. or initiate warden. And then once you've done it, you become a fellow warden. And then you work your way up to high warden, whatever that. No, green initiate. Yeah, I'm not happy with green initiate. One thing else I want to perhaps mention here as well is that I envisage there are more warden groups, that the Wardens of the West are just one of the 4 warden factions, some of which also don't exist, but one in particular does. So the Wardens of the North are a similar group that sort of go to cold declines, and they do still exist. And then you would have Wardens of the East and Wardens of the South. Perhaps some of those do exist, perhaps. So that's why I didn't want to reuse the cardinal directions, because I feel like there's a lot of interesting space we can do with other warden groups who have different agendas based on whatever climate they are. Green has that nature connection. So Kat's saying about green initiate that it sounds good. Green has that nature connection though. Maybe a little on the nose, but I think it's cute. Yeah, I think as a working title it's fine, but I think we can do better. So Morgan has observed, I'm interested in the first rank being giving the impression of being a person whose eyes have just been opened. Yeah. Open their eyes. Open their eyes. So get rid of these. I don't think we're going to use military ones. Watch person. Sentinel. Morgan has suggested sentinel something or watch person. Yeah. How about keeper of something? So you start your keeper of the night, keeper of the day, keeper of the woods or something, keeper the dark, keeper of the light. So Morgan is taking my suggestion from last week, which is the greatest, most powerful world building tool is thesaurus.com. Which yeah, watch person. I think watch person is already we're going to have like watch already has a lot of so when you're designing this, so I'm hesitating at watch person, and that leads to quite an interesting point on game design or world building, which is about separate magisteria, or keeping things separate, and not. You've got to be super careful when you're designing this stuff, because it's really easy to design something that overlaps with something else. So in the case of watch person, we have the Night's Watch, which is another faction, and the Day Watch, which is another faction for another third campaign I'm working on, which is hopefully going to be a spin-off of Black Griffin, but it's very, very early. So yeah, watch person is an interesting one, because then you've got to sort of be a bit careful when you're designing stuff that they stay separate and they have their own unique identity, and that things don't start to merge in with other things, like if you have 2 wizard factions, you've got to make sure there's a lot of clear blue water between them. Not to say that Morgan's suggestion is terrible. It just made me think of that particular principle, which is an important one. Yeah, open sentinel, watch person, someone who keeps their eyes open, or has had their eyes open. This is the problem with that is initiates really. I know what we could look at. I know what the inspiration for this is. Morgan's saying, unless you're the Terry Pratchett, want to make a joke about how they're all called all the same thing. Well, that too. Yeah. Good old Terry Pratchett. May you rest in peace. I know what my inspiration for this is. I don't know if I have the books here. I do have the books here. One sec. Aha. So, I know where this came from. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this before. These were very popular back in the day. So these are called Lone Wolf books. So in the 80s, in Britain particularly, although I think it went stateside as well, the cool thing to do was to go away. The max. Let me shut my. Sorry, one sec. The cool thing to play was fighting fantasy. They're incredibly popular, mostly because Dungeons and Dragons, you needed friends to play with, and one of the problems of being a geek in the 1980s is you didn't really have many friends. So fighting fantasy filled that gap. I don't know if you have played them, guys, or heard about them, but they're like solo playing books. So if you look here, you have a number of sections with numbers. And like, as you play it, you'll make decisions in the text. The text will offer you decisions, and then based on the decisions, you turn to a number in the book, and you sort of navigate the plot that way. And then one of the spin-offs was Lone Wolf, and the Lone Wolf had something called the Kai Lords, which was like a monastic, slightly monastic group. You can see that the character on the cup here is the central character, a Kai Lord. Yeah. Kat said choose your own adventure books. Basically, yeah. But there were more than choose your own adventure books, because you had like stats. Like it was a kind of mini role-playing game. You had like stats, you rolled in combat, you played through combat, you didn't just choose where you're going to go. It was slightly, effectively it was slightly more elaborate. Step up from choose your own adventure, but a step down from a full-blown role-playing game. So the Lone Wolf were a spin-off of the fighting fantasy books, set about this sort of ranger-like monastic order called the Kai Lords. So I'm hoping this will have some inspiration for me for ranks and names and things like that. But it doesn't. No. I think this is definitely what I've subconsciously been using as the inspiration for the Wardens of the West. These are sort of slightly more psychic kind of people. I don't think the Wardens of the West are entirely magical. I think magic's still quite rare with them. Okay. Anyway. Kai Lords, I don't think that really helps us very much. Steward. Well, yeah. Yeah, steward. But steward's just... that is a good word. Hawk Warden. I like that. Yeah. So you could have like... So Morgan... so steward is really a synonym for warden. Hawk Warden's quite nice. So it's perhaps annotated with... Yeah. You'd have Hawk Warden. Hare Warden? No, maybe not. Fox Warden. Wolf Warden, perhaps? Bear Warden? No. Yeah, I like that. Hawk, or perhaps Sparrow Warden? For the junior members, perhaps? Vigilance, another good one. What do we think of Sparrow Warden, and then you rank up to Hawk Warden? Do we like that? The only problem is it steps on the toes of Starling Kings, but I'm not married to the Starling King's name. So maybe we could change that. Vigilant. Yeah, Vigilant's actually quite a good one. You could start as a Vigilant, and then you rank up to Warden. Then you might make it to Fellow Warden, and then you might make it to High Warden. So, Morgan and Kat are asking about the animal names for the Wardens. Could be hierarchical. Yeah. So Morgan's said that instead of being hierarchical, perhaps they could also be categorical. So you have a Hawk Warden, a Fox Warden, or a Sparrow Warden, depending on their specialities. I do like that. Maybe that's so. Maybe you rank to Fellow Warden at the start, and then you can choose Hawk Warden, Fox Warden, or I'm going to say Sparrow Warden, but I'm not going to define what that. Yeah, that's quite nice. So maybe then you can sort of. I haven't really done this before with factions, but you could you could split off, and you could perhaps when you get to third rank, you could choose which title you want, and depending on that, you could get a completely different feature. Yeah, I do really like that. Let's check the time. I'm starting to get very hoarse. Actually, this is the wrong column as well. Oop. Oop. Okay, so I'm going to leave all this here because there's some juicy stuff in this. Fellowship's a word I can use when I write up the fluff a bit. Yeah, so cats are sort of like a subclass. Yeah, it's like a faction subclass, a sub-faction. Although, like at the moment, the factions I've written have been fairly monolithic. You have one set of hierarchies and that's it, and that kind of makes sense for like smaller factions like the Royal College of Magic and the Mercenary and the Merchants Guild. But I think it's going to be a problem for bigger factions who have more complicated hierarchies, like the Temple, which is supposed to be like the Catholic Church analog in my game world. I've sort of created one faction for that, but I'm not sure that entirely makes sense. So, but I haven't entirely figured out how sort of sub factions would fit in. So maybe it's just literally this. So Morgan said, yeah, like a sparrow takes a meek approach, a hawk takes a big picture view, and a fox is more surgical. Yeah, I like that. Or perhaps fox is sort of, or perhaps it's like more class based. Like fox is more, sparrow is perhaps some magical, perhaps more. Fox is more thief or roguish, and hawk is probably like rangerish, fighterish. Yeah, I do like that. Yeah, that has a lot of potential. And then I guess eventually you rank to just High Warden, whatever. And there's only one High Warden. I don't know what this fourth rank would be about. But yeah. So Kat's pointed out you need to be a bit careful here because this kind of thing can easily snowball, and I think that's quite correct. I don't, Dungeons and Dragons is already quite a complex game, so you have to be a bit careful of what you load on top of that. Already, we're making a big ask for players to figure out their race, the character class, their background, and now we're adding a faction on top of that. Plus, remembering all the other rules. Morgan's suggesting so that we just go with 4 ranks instead of typical 5. Yeah, that's a very good point. I don't know, we're not particularly married. We shouldn't be married to just having 4. In fact, I think Wizards of the Coast wrote some factions that don't have 5 ranks. But let's leave that blank because maybe the joys of going back through this, I'll go back through this and write this up properly and probably do a blog post about it next week. And the joy of that is then things naturally, once you start to fluff out a bit and to fill the features out, it becomes obvious sometimes what sits there. And I think we need to think how it's easy to differentiate between Hawk Warden, Fox Warden, or Sparrow Warden, but what does that mean? Like the class features, the faction features shouldn't be like class-like. So what do you offer a warrior like Hawk Warden versus a thief like Fox Warden or a magic like Sparrow Warden? Well, in fact, let's move on to that topic now. I think I'm quite happy with the ranks as they are. Sorry, I'm just checking my messages. Features. So, I think I have a pretty good idea of what the core feature is. Is that once you're members of the Wardens, I think what I'm sort of seeing is the Wardens are a sort of, perhaps the populist movement's a bad term, but they're certainly popular. Sorry, I thought the dog was there. So wherever they go, they're accorded respect. Everyone loves them. Perhaps it could be even more than that because they're supposed to be wanderers. So probably they have maybe it's more deeper than this. So what I'm thinking is that the first level features Oath of the Hearth, which is basically what I see is sort of, perhaps not oath is a bad word, the tradition of the hearth, which is that wherever a warden goes, they do all this like work to help people. So if they come to you and they ask for help, and if you live in the Westerly Reaches, everyone relies or did rely on the Wardens before they were wiped out by whatever mysterious force wiped them out. So basically, that means they, in return for that, they don't have any land, so they can't really collect wealth. So in return for that, they really need hospitality. So the tradition of the hearth means that you have to give. Everyone has to give shelter to the Wardens for at least one night, if they ask. That's okay. The only problem is I have a feeling it's very similar to the Acolyte background feature. But I think that's a good start. So Morgan's put a message in chat. Who gains from diffusion of power that the Wardens maintain? That's a good question. I suppose the common folk do. The people who swear who hold the traditions of the oath. Yeah, I guess so. Morgan's made a good point. Sounds like Strick's first god tradition. So Strick is a character from the sort of pre-campaign I'm running, which is basically, as I said last week, is running this classic adventure, B2 Keep on the Borderlands, which I think Kat's playing in as well. Let's see if you can see this. Yeah. And in that character, she's playing. They are playing Strick, a worshipper of the old gods, in particular the first god. And yeah, so the Wardens. Yeah, I have a feeling the Wardens would have powers associated with the old gods. They don't exactly hold with the old gods, and the old gods don't exactly demand worship in the same way that the new gods do, and so they might get powers from those. So, like, the tradition of the hearth would perhaps be, so everyone has to give shelter to anyone bearing the sign of the Wardens. So the Wardens have a sign, perhaps some sort of druidic kind of symbol, like a Blair Witch stick figure. And what stops people from using that? Perhaps there's some kind of curse as well. So if you pretend, so anyone can pretend to be a warden, and the Wardens don't have a strict hierarchy. So what's to stop someone pretending to be a warden? So, Curse of the Mask. Anyone pretending to be a warden incurs the wrath of the old gods. So, I think Morgan's onto a good one there. Perhaps the old gods. In fact, I'm going to make a mention here of old gods because I think we've not really mentioned them up here at all. And I think they sort of play a feature with the old gods. Perhaps they have some kind of deal with the old gods that can make an interesting alternative feature. Maybe that deal with the old gods is a second rank ability. Oh, thank you, Kat. Yeah, I think it's getting there. Again, I want to be a bit careful here because these features are, if we're using the old gods, then it's starting to give people powers, and once you give people powers, they start to look like class features, and then we start to step on the design of the classes. But maybe not. Maybe there's a way the old gods could infer like temporal power. With like classes give you powers, but maybe the old gods could give you powers that are the equivalent of a stronghold. Maybe, like, for example, they could magic a stronghold out of the woods and you go and live there. Or so Kat said, would this curse be entirely magical, or could there be people who make sure to keep others from impersonating them? So Morgan said, like, a subtle luck where you can reroll a die once a week. Yeah, luck's a good one. So Kat would ask, yeah, perhaps some kind of luck. Maybe a luck though that's not mechanical, or perhaps not combat or skill check oriented, or maybe it pertains to certain skill checks. Perhaps luck gives you bonus on dice that pertains to downtime activities and things like that. So you're not necessarily any more powerful, but you can do stuff. And Kat's asking, would this curse be magical? Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe there's... So Kat made a really good observation that maybe the curse is not magical in nature at all, but actually is maintained by perhaps a group of people. And perhaps it's not even a curse. Perhaps if people find out that you're pretending to be a warden, they burn you in the Wicker Man or something like that. I'm not literally going to have burn you in the Wicker Man because that's pretty hackneyed, but I think that's got a lot of really juicy stuff. Yeah, okay, yeah, Morgan made a good point. It's a mythology that hold people in check are like that, yeah. Rather than it being like real power, like, not real power, it is real power, but rather than it being, you know, actual divine intervention. Because as well, I still want the Low Kingdoms to have quite remote gods. So yeah, I think I've already got really a bunch of stuff to work on with this. I'm pretty happy. It's getting quite late, so I think I'm going to put a pin in the Wardens of the West right there. But I really want to thank Kat and Morgan. I think this has got a hell of a lot more potential than when I started with, and I really like Hawk Warden, Fox Warden, and Sparrow Warden. That's really nice. I can imagine the players like, oh yeah, I really want to be a Fox Warden. That sounds so cool. I'm wanting to rank up, and I think we've got a lot of juice here. So I'm going to wrap up a bit. I've got a few agenda points to finish up with. So I want to say thank you, not just to Morgan and Kat for being involved in chat, but all the people watching. I want to thank my players. Hope, Kat, Morgan, Liam and Chris, who really helped me to grow as a Dungeon Master, which is why I can do this kind of game design at all, really. And Mark as well, who's one of my ex-players, but he was quite a big contributor. Again, go to grizzlyeye.com. If you're interested in what I'm doing, go to grizzlyeye.com. You can follow me there on RSS if you're still using that. You can follow me on twitter.com. The link's on Discord. Obviously, follow me on Discord, and you can follow me on YouTube. So I'll be posting up catch-up videos on YouTube and on Twitch, depending on what you prefer. So follow me. Buy the Vermin, please, as well. You can buy the Virgin from the DM's Guild. Actually, we just got a review this week up, so I haven't actually checked if we have any purchases, but yeah. It's available for purchase, $1.99. That's a pretty reasonable thing. And yeah, like, thanks guys, and I really enjoyed tonight. I think we made a lot of really good progress, and yeah, I'll try and do this again in another fortnight. Can't see why I wouldn't. I haven't decided what we'll do next time. I might even wonder if this still needs a bit of work, so we might continue with this, or we might focus on one of the other factions. But I'll decide that and let you know on Twitter. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you everyone for coming. I had really good fun tonight. Bye.